Thank you for your warm welcome to be with you in Prague. Of course, it was very difficult during COVID. I'm so pleased to be back in your lovely city again. I very much appreciate your invitation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes.
There is my title. The point I really want to pick up is this story evolves. We're never going to arrive at the destination. We have to keep thinking, keep adapting, keep reflecting. Thomas Halleck, you don't say it like that in Czech, has already told us that. I appreciate that point very much. How do I find a way in? I feel a little embarrassed. I feel that how can I possibly tell you anything you don't already know? You've been studying this topic over many years, particularly intensively recently. But I just picked up from chapter 2 in the Afternoon of Christianity, one of the chapters we were sent to read, this point about opinion polls and do we find answers in opinion polls. Now, I know there's some quantitative scholars here, and I don't want to denigrate your work in any way, but what I think about statistical work is it shows us where to ask the questions. It's the takeoff point, it's not the arrival point. So they're fundamental, accurate, careful statistics are fundamental, but they're a stimulant. Why is it like this? But I was very captured by this point of Professor Halleck saying, I often say but, and I'm asked, am I a believer, am I a Christian? Do I believe in God? Well, I've been thinking about that for many years, and this is the reason why. This is an opinion poll it's quite early, it's in the 1960s in Britain, it's late 1960s. And the question was, do you believe in God? And the individual says, yes. And then the questioner says, do you believe in a God who can change the course of events on Earth? No. Just the ordinary one. Since then, 30 years ago, I wrote about this. What is an ordinary God? I think that's very profound. I don't think it's trivial. And that's been the point of departure for much of my work, and it's why I began thinking about this notion of believing and belonging. That's where I began, and I think there is synergy between your work and mine. But most of all, I want to speak about context today, because I'm trained in sociology. I have no theological training. I've picked up bits and pieces along the way. I've had to, but it's not a formal training. And so I'll stay in my comfort zone, which is social science. And again, this is a quotation, a little citation from that chapter. Belief and unbelief are not objective realities. It's existing independently of the observer. I'm not going to read it all, you can read it yourselves. What we have to do is to locate the observer, locate the individuals. What is the society that they live in? Who are they? Where are they? Why are they thinking like that? Questions about God and the essence of man repeatedly demand plausible, meaningful, and intelligible answers in the context of a particular culture and historical situation. And I think that's where I can make a contribution. It's, again, tricky, because you know a great deal more about Central and East Europe than I do. I know more about the West, and we've got to try and work together to get the best combination of our talents. But we also have to recognise that in each of our contexts, in my context as well as yours, there are massive contradictions and different things happening at once. And I want to pick apart some of these things as to why we have this huge emphasis on the nuns and secularization and the leaving of religion at precisely the moment when religion has re-entered the public square. That's not very helpful. And I'll show you why. That we have things going in every direction at once, and we need to pay attention at these as it were, contradictions that surround us. So, in returning to my title, I'm saying this is not only a contradictory and complex story, but a continually evolving one. We pitch in, if you like, in 2024. In 2030, I suspect things may be very different. We'll see. How do we make sense of it? I'm going to stick mostly to the West European case, the case I know, but there will be allusions to other parts of the world. Just very quickly, a note on where my material comes from. I'm not going to dwell on this, we don't have time. There is this huge, rapidly expanding literature on no religion and non-belief. Think of the project that Lois Lee, my colleague in the UK, has directed. I mean, the amount of projects and publications and books, articles and papers that have come out of that is formidable. And much discussion. Templeton, interestingly, not only has funded your project, it's funded so many others in a field which you might think doesn't interest Templeton. I find that curious. I find that very interesting that they've put so much money into studying unbelief. I feel very proud to remind you, or perhaps you don't know, I don't know if you do or don't know, I refereed that proposal when it was sent to Templeton. I look back at my referee's report. I was quite right in recommending that you should have the money and look what has come from it. But I went right back to the beginning and saw the proposal and looked at how I responded to it. I said I had to be a bit agnostic about your laboratory for working with young people. I want to know more about that. You can tell me over lunch or something, because it intrigued me. I didn't know much about that. What has struck me is if you also look at the big bodies of literature that are growing very rapidly, the other one that's growing is the literature on populism. It's already been alluded to. This is an unpleasant at best and rather dangerous element at worst, which is emerging in many parts of Europe and beyond. And I find the fact that unbelief and populism are both flourishing at the same time is where we need to think. Is one causing the other or not? And does that vary in different parts of the world? Now, in due course, I'll tell you what I think. Of course, you're free to disagree or give another opinion. That would be very interesting. But the other thing I think that is very interesting is just in the title of that, is funders are very conscious of what societies are anxious about. Because the money normally goes to where there is anxiety. Money is limited, and it is prioritized often for the things we are concerned about. That's why there are more projects than we can possibly imagine about AI at the moment. All the funders are putting their money there. These are just quickly where I've grounded some of this material. I won't do this in detail. This Oxford Handbook of Religion in Europe, which I co-edited with my colleague who is a whole generation younger than me. He comes from a different country and a different discipline. But it was a very enjoyable partnership. We worked together extremely well. It meant I read an awful lot about a whole range of things in Europe quite intensively, quite quickly. When I got to the end of it, the case studies at the end, I realized how much anxiety there was about religion in many parts of Europe. Gone are the days post-1990 when it was all going to be right, we had the answers. These were euphoric decades, I shared that euphoria. But the anxiety is now very present. I think of the chapter on the Netherlands, or that part of Europe, thinking of the Netherlands as tolerant and accepting, and then realizing that there are very strong currents in that country which are inimical to certain forms of religion. It's also true in Nordic Europe, again, what was known as a secular, tolerant part of the world. It's not. There are some very antagonistic groups, many of them now, and we'll come to this point, adopting religion as a means of exclusion in a country which is part of the world which is markedly secular. And then there's a couple of articles at the bottom. I think I'm going to leave these slides here. You can pick up the references where I've brought those things up to date. One is, of course, the chapter in the book that we just talked about. This is my first really important slide, and there are only two really important slides, all right? So here we go. How am I doing? Okay, I hope. This is dated from an article in 2006, and it concerns my building of a model that captures as much as I could about religion in Europe. Aware already that there were different pressures. I mean, this is not a new thing. I think they're more noticeable now. Now, I started with the cultural heritage of Europe, which is clearly Christian. I mean, there are, of course, parts of Europe where Muslims have been there for a very long time, but by and large, it was Christianized early, and the way I tell my students to think of this is think of time and think of space. You think of the week or the weekend, or you think of seasons, or you think of festivals, or you think of the way we count in Europe. It's all coming from a Christian background. My students don't realise that. I say to them, why do you stay in bed on Sundays? And they think, well, I don't know. You know, why Sundays? But, I mean, there is a patterning there, a deep patterning, which is not going to change. And it can be quite tricky for people who come in from outside who have a different rhythm. A good point to make, of course, is secular people are not at all discomforted by that pattern. They're just the opposite way, sort of mirror image of it. Space. Well, again, something I learned in teaching, try to train your students to look out of the window rather than in a book. I mean, look across Prague. Wonderful example, and it's a Christian skyline. And we are a bit offended if that's violated. Quite a lot of people in Europe do not like that skyline to be altered, and they're not Christians at all in any practice. But look around, I mean, one very good place to look is the huge mosque in Oxford, which was extremely contentious when it was built. And the kind of arguments they used to resist it were devious. All sorts of historic walls suddenly had to be protected. Nobody thought about them at all until the mosque came. Look at East End of London. You don't see a Christian skyline, always. So look, again, I think time and space, they're very deep characteristics of any society. They tell you an awful lot. And then what I've called vicarious religion, this, as it were, the old post-Constantine model in Europe, which is patterned on space, on national church, diocese in many places, and above all, the parish, the building block of European society, which is both secular and religious. It varies in different places, but often the secular government is built on a parish as well. And it's a territorial model. It's not chance, it's where it comes from somewhere. And the religious element of it is a public utility. It is there at the point of need for anybody who lives in that environment. You have certain rights in my country, in England, to your parish church. A right to be married there, that kind of thing. It's a model that you leave. It's not a model that you join, because you're there already. Quite different from the United States, which I've talked about vicarious religion all over Europe. I've often had to use an interpreter. It takes a little work to try and get the idea across to the interpreter, but your audience will always understand what you say. It will resonate with them deep down somewhere in their experience. I've tried in the United States, and it's a waste of time. They do not understand it because a public utility is not part of American life. It's a very deep cultural thing, but it's fading. And the way I initially conceived it, the book published in 2000, it was entirely benign. It was fine. If you didn't use it, it doesn't matter, but it was a good thing. You know, nobody really worried about that. That's changing. But over the top of it grew a market. People began to choose their religion. This comes from the Reformation, of course, and the choices proliferated. They spread beyond Christianity. And this is a model that you elected to join. You could leave it as well, but it wasn't something that you were sort of, it was part of you before you did anything. It was an active choice. And it's growing, and the market's expanding. Now, into this market come many, many newcomers, especially in Western Europe, as wave after wave of migration has brought many different people into Europe. Now, in 2006, I found 3 waves. One was the rebuilding of the big economies of Western Europe after the war, in the 1950s and 60s. Britain, France, West Germany then, and the Netherlands. That grew considerably as the decades passed. And in the flick of an eyelid, Italy or Spain, Greece and Ireland went from being countries of emigration to countries of immigration. Look at Dublin. That turned almost, I say on a sixpence, that's a tiny coin in England, in Britain. In the flick of an eyelid, Dublin ceased to be a poor country that people, city that people left, and became a really hip place to go. A significant migration into Ireland. Absolutely changed Ireland. Well, one of the elements has changed Ireland. After 2004, there was a huge move of people coming from this part of Europe into the West to work. 1 million Poles arrived in Britain. That shook the Catholic Church quite considerably. I mean, I'm not sure whether they were pleased or sorry, but it changed it, that was for sure. And you began to see too the growth in secular alternatives. The nuns grew, and the secular reactions were beginning to articulate, some of them vehement. I was also aware at this time and beginning to work on the notion that Europe was exceptional in global terms. I won't do the detail of that because there isn't really time this morning, except to remind you that most of the social science that we're using to understand religion in the world comes from Europe. So that our models, our thinking, were not very helpful in many parts of the world, but we were distinctly arrogant and continued using the models and bent the data to fit the model. Social science does that. It's not good social science. 2006, this was around the turn of the millennium. I've been thinking for some time, and I put it together in an article. This was the framework. First key slide. Second key slide. Nearly there. 2024, now, okay? What's happened to my model? Cultural heritage has not changed, but the signs of change are, it's not fundamentally changed, but you can see bits of it eroding. Certain parts of European cities are very, very diverse now. And the Christian skyline is not as evident. And there are challenges in the workplace about how to handle diversity in terms of time and rhythm and holiday. And can you have a day off to celebrate Eid or whatever? You know, these challenges become increasing. And it's because newcomers don't fit these very deep down standard plans. So it's still there, but there's tension. Now, vicarious religion, here I think there was a noticeable and negative shift. I'm a little offended by this because the term I created, sort of, vicarious means to do something on behalf of. A parish priest celebrates the Mass on behalf of everyone. I mean, it's very deep in theology as well as but I introduced it into this sociological debate to an extent. And what I was capturing, I thought, was a kind of wistful attachment to an older church. I'm glad it's there. I like my village church. I like the people in power. I don't go there, but I have affection for it. I don't want you to remove it. Now, what I think has happened, and I think this relates very much to the debate about populism, is this has been weaponized in a way that if you don't accept that premise, you are not one of us. In other words, it's a claim of identity rather than inheritance or theological teaching. And if you don't share my identity, you are not one of us. In other words, if you don't have these sensitivities towards inheritance, you are excluded. And look at the Danish case, or look at the Swedish case of the New Democrats, or the Lutheran Church becomes the mark of Danishness, or the Swedish Church, the mark of being Swedish. And if you are not a member of that, you are not fully Swedish. And that's turned on Muslims. Quite definitely. And I find it distressing, particularly when I find the term in the literature. I mean, they use lots of other terms, like culturalized religion. I think there's something very profound there if you go back to the notion of Weber's Protestant ethic, that religion has an ethic. And what we're beginning to see is the religion without the ethic. And that's dangerous. And I think that's one of the roots of populism, which is a very complex thing. We're going to leave the market for the moment. I don't think that's changed all that much, except that it's grown and it's becoming extremely various, if you like. I mean, the choice just proliferates, and it goes into the spiritualities, it goes into the minority religions. The only thing I would pick up is sometimes, I think I'm guilty of this too, we don't pay enough attention to the edges, the fringes, the sects and the cults. I used to say, and I still would say this, that sociology has been disproportionately attentive to very small groups and ignored the mainstream. I'm a bit more measured now because I've come to understand that if the small groups, like Jehovah's Witnesses, or minority Muslim groups are having a bad time, that's a bad sign. Think of what's happening in Russia. If the minorities are exposed, look carefully at that regime. You might be next. And I think that we have in English, you call that a bellwether or a pit canary. You know what I mean by a canary, a bird in a mine? If it begins to feel poorly, you all should be paying attention. And that's what I think it is. If you see the minorities suffer, watch out. Now, the new arrivals, the next point. 2015 on, of course, there was a new wave of arrivals into Europe. This was after the war in Syria. And it's this wave that has not stopped. And it's people from the Middle East and beyond, a lot of people from Afghanistan. And this is the crisis of immigration. The focus is the crisis of immigration right across Europe. And of course, some countries are more exposed than the others. The West is more exposed than the East. But it has completely altered the debate in terms of its scale and immediacy. And then the secular reactions are coming. How do we deal with this? what are we going to do? I mean, it absolutely dominates debate in the UK. It's an ill-informed and ill-mannered debate. I'll come on to that again. I think, and it's going to, it's accelerated, of course, by climate change, because there are going to be many parts of particularly Africa, where it will be impossible to live because of drought, and so, you know, it's going to increase. And we're at the moment just trying to stop it, and I don't think that's the right way. I mean, it would be much more profound in that. And I would just add a final point that I've slightly changed my vocabulary, and actually it was Staff Hellemans, I think, who picked up the point that he didn't think Europe was an exceptional case. I'm prepared to meet him halfway and say I think it's a distinctive case. Exceptional is a bit misleading because it tends to say Europe is this and everybody else is that. We are, in fact, all exceptional cases. And it's distinctive, but we still have the problem that we tend to impose European theory and thinking onto colleagues from other parts of the world. I've been distressed at times, and I haven't worked outside Europe very much, but I went to China once and I went to Mexico once, worked with extremely talented doctoral, postdoctoral students, working in a second or third language for them. They listened to me very attentively, told me about their projects and said, Grace, what theory should I use? Tell me what theory should I use? I said, don't look at Western theory. Have the confidence of your own imagination to understand your own situation. But they said, but we have to know Western theory to pass our exams. That is colonialism. And it worries me. And there were such clever students who, you know, I hope they find the solution themselves. So, quick summary now. More than one thing is happening at once, we know that. Secularization is growing steadily. We're not going to turn that around. It may slow down. I think if you look across Europe, it's slowing in the places where it's most advanced. I think there is the stopping point. I don't think it's going to go to nothing. But the ones who started late, like Poland or Ireland, are catching up fast. So too is religious diversity. That's growing fast, particularly in the West. Now, I think we've created a very big problem for ourselves in this field. Secularization, amongst other things, leads to eroding practice and eroding belief, but an inability to comprehend what it means to be religious. We've lost our imagination and we've lost the vocabulary that we need to talk about it. At the same time, religious diversity is pushing religion back into the public sphere, into public debate. And there's some very sharp reactions to that. And the debate, and I've used these words before, ill-informed and ill-mannered. People are rude and unhelpful. It's discourteous at best and sometimes worse. And what intrigues me is I learned my sociology in the 1960s, ages ago. And then we were taught by people like Brian Wilson that religion was fade from the public sphere, be retained in the private life, and I suppose will gradually erode, even in private life. Now what has happened? It's eroding rapidly in private life, and it's back in the public sphere. These partnerships, lack of them, evolve. It's changing. Now we have this problem with too many people who have sort of stepped back and don't have the understanding, go and talk to people in the Foreign Office or whatever in England. They have to deal with religion, both at home and abroad, on a regular basis, and they don't know how to do it. I won't take my time now, but I'd love to tell you about what's happening at the LSE, where I did my PhD, in terms of trying to do something about this. The unexpected doesn't happen. Certainly can. there is a growth in proportion of nuns. We know that, and you're working on that. That's all great. And the return of religion to public life, and the very strident reaction to this should not be happening. It is happening, how we deal with it. It should not be happening. And it discomforts a lot of secular people. But I read last week in my newspaper, or all over the press in fact, that Richard Dawkins has declared himself a cultural Christian. Well, I didn't think that was going to happen. I'm not quite sure what he means, but it was unexpected. And Hissi Ali has become, she says, a Christian. These are extraordinary things. You know, those real antagonists, for some reason, were stepping back. Another is Tom Holland. He's a historian. Don't muddle him up with the actor. But he's a historian of religion, Tom Holland. He wrote a book called Dominion, which is very widely read. And he's stepping, well, I think he can call himself a Christian, an active Christian. Sometimes I think, what is going to happen next? I just do not see these things coming. But at the same time, we have this marked rise in populism. Not always, but very often associated with conservative, intolerant forms of religion. And it's about identity. It's not for equal practice. And I think it's about this form of religion which has lost Max Weber's ethic. And I think there is material in sociology to help us, but I'm not sure that we've seen it or we're exploiting it yet, or using it. The goal here is exclusion, not inclusion. It's not reassuring in any way. It's a very, very worrying feature of society. But of course in France, it has a much more, it moved from a Catholic expression to laicity. If you are not laïc, you are not French. Only the French can say that. I can't do this, there isn't time, but I just want to point 2 or 3 examples of differences in different places. Slightly lighter touch, so we'll end perhaps with a smile. Go on to this. This is a slide. It's in the paper if you want to look at it. The left side, as I'm looking at it anyway, is West Europe, and the right side is East Europe. And it's the proportion of nuns in the population, and the little line at the top is young people, so it's where we're going next. Why is it that in Central and East Europe, the difference between the countries is so much bigger than the West? Look at Romania and Poland compared with the Czech Republic and Estonia. It's a huge difference. And one of you please explain that to me at some point, because I don't understand that. Whereas on the West, it's a much more step by step, mostly from Catholic towards Protestant. But that just intrigues me. I thought, well, I'll take my chance and ask the question. I'm not going to talk about neighbouring societies between the Czech Republic and Poland, because that's your seat, as it were. Just one anecdote from France and Britain, and this comes from COVID. And I do commend you for picking up that point, because I think COVID is a wonderful, wonderful laboratory. I mean, it was devastating. I don't underrate the damage that COVID did. It's going to take a generation or more to recover, particularly amongst young people. It worries me. But I sent to my beloved French colleagues, I know them very well, a picture of a medieval cathedral in England. There are 4 or 5 who were operating as vaccination centres. So they opened the cathedral, and that's where they did vaccinations. Plenty of space, and I wouldn't say it's not used at weekends, but please don't understand it that way. But it was possible for them to do it. You had to be careful of things like how many steps there were, and could you park your car? There were tricky things like that. But this became quite prestigious. If you had the choice, you went to a cathedral to have your vaccination, especially the organ was playing. It was quite a nice experience. I sent this picture to my French colleagues, and they were appalled. You know, they couldn't get over the fact that there could be this kind of collaboration. Of course, what happened also in the UK was step by step, this meant that mosques could be used. The problems with mosques, because they have carpets, but they were entirely practical problems, and that was a medical hygiene thing. But it did encourage minority communities like Muslims who were very apprehensive about mass election to go to somewhere familiar. And then there was quite a lot of work, very interesting work, about co-opting imams and religious leaders of all kinds in order to optimise the vaccination programme in the UK. There's not a lot I'm proud of about the UK at the moment, but I am proud of that. And that was out of the question in France. Out of the question. And that's just little instances of how this process is going to be so different. We are neighbours of the French, you are neighbours of Poland, you know how different Poland is. We need to pay attention to these details. And my final point. Is populism a reaction to growing secularism, or is it a reaction to growing religious diversity? Now, in Western Europe, I think it's a reaction to growing religious diversity, particularly directed in Islam. I think I have to say that, we have to face that. In the US, I think the fear is of secularism. What I read about the new Christian right and Christian nationalism is a fear of the values that they stand for being eroded by an increasingly secular population. And here COVID is also important because COVID closed their churches. This was the state telling religion what to do. And I think in America, the dynamic, if you like, this triangle of secular, diverse, religious diversity, and populism, I think the triangle is slightly differently shaped in the US than it is in Europe. And then you're just beginning to think about that. These things are complex, contradictory, fascinating, difficult to understand, and continually evolving. I do congratulate you on your project. I'm very pleased to be here to hear you debate now. Thank you.